This is Command Post, a series of discussions about military matters from Time and the Center for a New American Security.
Meg, I'm wondering 10 years after 9/11, if you can sort of paint a picture for us of what U.S. troops and their families have gone through over this decade.
Sure. Well, the really interesting thing to remember is that there have been tremendous successes in this decade. Our military is probably the most trained and capable military that we've had because nothing trains troops and leaders quite like actually deploying and doing what they're supposed to do. So we have a tremendously capable force, but with those deployments and with those experiences have come some tolls. Families and service members have had repeated deployments time and time again with little time on the ground between deployments. The other thing that's really interesting is we've had a decade now of people signing into a military, enlisting or accepting a commission with a very changed expectation from their predecessors. You know, prior to 9/11, service members could have expected maybe a deployment in their future. After 9/11, these young people are signing into a military that they know is going to include deployments, and that's a very different circumstance. And I can't help but stand in awe of those kids that sign up knowing what they've signed up for. When we look at the difference between families that signed up before and families that signed up afterwards, there's some significant differences. You know, National Guard families, for example, never really anticipated that their guardsmen would be deployed outside our country for our country's defense. They thought that their guardsmen were signing up to be deployed on behalf of their states. And that sets a different stress on the family.
And we literally could not have fought these past 10 years without the Guard and the
Absolutely.
Reserves. And I just wanted to emphasize that point, that in 2005 or so, 40% of the troops on the ground in Iraq were National Guard. So the ability of the United States to call upon what used to be called somewhat derisively weekend warriors, and we are now at a point where the Guard and the Reserves are really fully integrated into the Department of Defense, to the point that General Corelli, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, has said that we literally cannot conduct even a middle-sized operation now without calling on the Guard and Reserves for help. And that's been, I think, one of the really major changes over the last decade.
Absolutely.
But I can remember in the early years after 9/11, the Army is going to break. The Army is on the verge of breaking. It ended up being a very supple and limber branch. It didn't snap. It bent, it stretched, it strained, but it never broke. Why do we think that is?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Primarily, although we don't tend to report on the positives of this experiences, military families will tell you that there are both negatives and positives to being a military family during this time. They're tremendously proud of their service members. They've learned skill sets at home that they might not have learned if their service member had not deployed. We have young spouses that for the first time in their lives were independent and running their own household alone. It's not something they would choose to do for the longer term, but it did develop that strength and independence on them. And financially, for better or worse, deployment is a financial positive for families. Nobody's going to become rich while serving in uniform, but deployment does help ameliorate some of the financial strains of being a young military family.
Meaning the additional combat pay they get.
The additional combat pay, and even more than that, the tax benefits that they receive while they're deployed.
Pay in a combat zone is not taxed. I think all of that is true, and I think the willingness of families to allow their service members to stay in and continue to fight has been crucial. But so has the willingness of America's young people to sign up knowing that they were going to war.
Yes.
And knowing that there was every chance that some of them weren't going to come home, that they were going to come home horribly maimed. And these young people have continued to sign up for these fights because they've believed in the country, they believed in the military. And I really think we have a huge obligation to this generation of people who fought these wars, what H.R. McMaster described as the long war, for a 10-year period, and the bills are going to come due for that really over the next several generations. And I think America really has a sacred trust to those
John,
people.
I would just add one caveat to your enthusiasm, and that is I think what we, particularly in the last few years, we've seen this strong recruiting and retention. It's come right in the depths of this economic recession, if not depression. Obviously, historically, the military has done much better when economic times are bad. And what we saw in the middle of the decade early on, when the economy was doing better, some of the services were hurting on recruiting, including the Army, even some of the special operations forces, the elites. And I think if the economy, when it turns around and young people have choices coming out of school, facing these kind of deployments that you're talking about, facing the strains on the family that Meg's talked about, they may not necessarily sign up in the droves they are now.